Yo, too, I got a major problem, man.
What happened?
Yo, you know how I moved out to the farm a few years ago?
Yeah.
Man, it's an old rinky-dink house. The roof is falling apart. Siding's coming off the wall. Man, you got anybody I can call?
Actually, I know exactly the person for that, for roofing and siding, and they can do your house, residential, and commercial work.
Really?
Yeah, they're called Horizon Builders. They're started by local Hmong guys here in the Twin Cities, and they're your go-to guys.
Really? Hmong-owned, too?
Hmong owned, Hmong operated, and bringing value to Hmong people when it comes to reconstruction.
Hey, that's awesome, man. Yeah, because this is something I definitely don't want to DIY.
All right, so I'll get you the number, Horizon Builders.
Yeah, please do. So if you guys have any work that needs to be done on your residential house or commercial building at all, make sure you hit up Horizon Builders. They're a newer company, and they're out there doing a lot of great work. And we're very grateful for them for sponsoring us and just allowing us to kind of continue the work that we're doing here. So thank you. Yeah. Yo, so we just filmed a great episode with Dr. Alyssa Vang. But we also wanted to apologize because we had some issues with the camera, and not everything got recorded. We did get the full audio, but as you guys are listening to the episode, just keep in mind we dropped the ball on our end, and we apologize to you guys as viewers and Dr. Alyssa.
Yeah, we're really sorry, Dr. Alyssa, for messing that up. We're still learning, as always, no excuse, but we're still learning, and we hope you enjoy the podcast.
Yes, and for you guys too, if you guys know your way around a camera and you guys want to come and help us grow and develop this podcast, maybe this is your chance. Reach out to us.
Okay.
All right, welcome to the No Egg Podcast, No Eggs Podcast. Today we have our highly anticipated guest today,
Yes.
Dr. Alyssa Vang. I'm just going to do your intro. Sure. Just going to read it because you have quite an extensive intro here. So she's considered a pioneer and leading the Hmong community in the mental health field. She is the first licensed Hmong-speaking psychologist in Minnesota. She is the CEO and founder of Vanguard Health, located in Woodbury, Minnesota. Dr. Vang currently leads a team of bilingual and mental health clinicians by providing culturally responsive mental health services. And one of my favorite things about you and how I met you actually is you are also a Hmong children's book author. Some of my kids' favorite books, on Grandpa's Farm and On and At Grandma's Garden. We actually talked about this too because I was telling Tu early on about how I wanted to create a children's book about the farm, and then the next week later we were at the Hmong Arts and Craft Fair, I believe.
Yes.
And then I saw that you had the book, and I was like, oh my gosh, she beat me
She's
to the
ahead of the
punch.
game.
Yeah.
Yours is probably even more fascinating because you actually live on a farm. So I think it would be so amazing.
No, but I thought that was so awesome, and so I just remember talking to Tu about that, and just feeling like, she beat me to the punch. And then I actually got a chance to meet you, and that was before I even knew that you were a mental health therapist, and so it was like really cool to have a conversation with you. And I met you and your husband. You guys were great people. And so welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. It's great to be here. You know, I have to confess, I feel like I'm out of my element a little bit because I'm kind of in the cool kids corner right now. So
No, we're nothing cool about us.
Yeah.
Nothing cool about us. This is a middle-aged man here trying to do.
We're trying to be cool. We're trying to continue to stay relevant. We acknowledge that we're like on our way out. You know?
Yes.
No, but I love the relevant piece. I think this is a great thing that you're doing, providing this space to have conversations that are real, that are down to earth and relatable and relevant.
Thank you.
This is very powerful.
No, thanks. Yeah, we always with Peng. I think that's one thing that it stems from what we wanted to see out there too. So for me, it was like, hey, it'd be cool to hear, especially Hmong men, right? Initially, this was started as like we're not therapists of any kind, but we just want to express our emotions publicly to kind of make it acceptable and to make it like, hey, we're a new generation, like we're a new generation now, and we're not even that new generation. We're mid-30s, we're the 2000s kids, but it's okay to talk about all of these things. And that's kind of how it started. And then, you know, it kind of dove into having different guests and stuff like that. So it's kind of like I guess we're free-flowing a little bit.
Yeah, we've been very fortunate. And, you know, we're so happy that it turned into what it turned into, and we're very blessed. But yeah, at the beginning it was just Tu and I, and then now it's kind of turned into what we realized when we started this too, or during this process, was that I think there is a need for this.
Yeah.
I think young people are intimidated to do like these larger platforms, Hmong TV, Hmong radio, and so we kind of created this, and you know, it's our opportunity to share what other young people are doing, what people are doing that are kind of unique, and these smaller stories. I always say, like, you know, when people outside of our community come and want to talk about Hmong people, they always pick the same 5 people, right? And they share their stories, which is great.
Right.
And but we wanted to highlight some of the smaller people, some of the people doing unique and cool things.
Diversity and
yeah,
voices.
exactly.
Exactly. Diversity in our Hmong people. You
Yeah.
know?
Very true.
Just
Very
showing
true.
like, hey,
we're not
we have artists, we have architects, we have people going to like working for
Business
NASA, we got
owners.
judges,
Yeah.
we got farmers,
Yeah.
Right.
we got guys who clean cars. You know, so we
and
have
everybody's
everything.
doing their thing and
exactly.
creating their own quality of life and their
Yeah.
best, you know, life. And so, yeah, it's great to magnify those voices.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. But thank you for that. First of all, like, tell us a little bit about yourself, like how you came up and what got you interested in the field that you're in now, because you were the first Hmong-speaking psychiatrist.
Psychologist.
Psychologist.
Yes. Can I speak to the psychiatrist?
Yeah,
and
let's talk about that
psychologist?
right now.
And
Psychologist,
what is the
psychiatrist.
difference?
Because the reason why I want to speak to it is it's such a common comment that people make.
The mix-up?
Yes,
Yeah.
the mix-up.
Okay.
Because sometimes they wonder if I'm a psychiatrist or a psychologist. And I get it. You know, in the community, if you don't live and breathe mental health, it's hard to know. But a psychiatrist is someone who has gone through medical school.
Okay.
So they've gone through medical school, and you know, during medical school, they try out different specialties, whether it's urology, whether it's family practice, whether it's pediatric work, whether it's cardiology or whatever it is, and psychiatry is one of them. And then once they're done with their training, then they choose the residency. And so a psychiatrist has a medical degree and can prescribe medication.
Okay.
They get MD at the end?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Okay.
They have the MD at the end, and they can prescribe medication. They also do some counseling, but oftentimes people who employ psychiatrists would much rather have them focus on the medication piece. of it.
Sure.
Gotcha.
Whereas psychologists, we go through a program that either has a PhD or a PsyD. And so I have a PsyD, which is a doctorate in psychology.
Yes.
And then there's the doctorate in philosophy, which is the PhD.
Okay.
And we do not prescribe medication. We do not have prescription privileges.
Yes.
We do more psychotherapy or counseling.
Is there a lot of study in pharmacology as well, in a PsyD as well, just to have the understanding of how that might impact your client, for example?
Yes.
Okay.
So during my grad school training, we would have a couple of classes in pharmacology, just so that we can understand the impact of the medication.
Right.
But we have been told and trained that we are not experts. So we don't provide any counseling or any advice on medication.
Right.
We know enough to either guide them to make decisions or to help them to talk through it, but we often defer them to their prescribing provider, whether it's a family practitioner, whether it's a nurse practitioner, or a psychiatrist, to make those decisions with them.
Yeah, no, great. I think that answers a lot because Peng made that mistake, but that's the mistake that I've made as well. And I think
It's
a lot of
common
people, correct.
I just got that question the other day too. So.
Because psychiatrist, psychologist to us, for example, is just it's a treatment of mental
Yeah, to
that,
me,
right? That's the way
Right,
we look
medical
at it.
conditions,
Yeah, medical
right.
condition.
Yeah,
mental condition. Yeah.
yeah, I almost use it interchangeably, but it's good to know the difference too. I should know the difference because my wife is in grad school right now,
Oh,
going
okay.
going
Yeah.
for that. So
And I should know that too because I have a buddy named James who,
he
who
just
really
got his
looks up to
ID,
you.
right?
No, he will next year. He's
Yeah.
Okay.
yeah, he's
Yeah,
working
yeah.
towards that, and him and
That's
his girlfriend are
fascinating.
really big into you.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, here's the thing, right? Back to your question, Peng. How did I get started? And for me, because I've been on this journey for much longer than a lot of other colleagues or those who are still in the pipeline, it was a very lonely journey, but it's fascinating that now we have so many people
Yeah.
who are into the mental health field and studying, whether they're still in graduate school, whether they're already working, whether they're working towards licensure. But it's really amazing to see that growth. And just a few years ago, I went to a conference, and comparing like that conference from 15, 20 years ago, the room was full of just Hmong, mental health providers, and many of them young, like you guys, many of them younger, and to me, it was very encouraging, and I felt so proud to see that many of them have gone into that field because 15, 20 years ago, it was just a handful of us.
Yeah.
And then if you go to a conference, it would be Mikadal.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, let me ask you, what kind of drove you into this field? Like when you were growing up as a high schooler and then going to college, like what is it? Was there a specific event? Was there something, a conflict that you crossed? What was the trigger that made you say, hey, this is a field that I think I'm going to have a deep interest in and I'm curious about, I want to know more about it?
Well, I mean, having come here to the United States, I came when I was 7.
Okay.
And that was really in the mid 70s, late 70s.
Okay.
And so when we came, we really didn't have a lot of guidance. We were still fumbling through life, figuring out all of the different barriers. And I was fortunate because my dad does speak English, so I had some advantages in terms of protective factors.
Sure.
But really, on your own personal journey as a child, as a refugee, as a teenager, there really isn't a lot of guidance around career choice.
Right.
Because back in the days, and I would imagine it still happens to some degree right now, but back in the days, the messaging to us as Hmong daughters were to get married young.
Right. Yes.
Because if you don't get married young, you're going to be an old maid.
Right.
Go low. And so oftentimes the messaging would say, if you don't get married before, such and such an age, you're going to not have a lot of viable bachelors,
Right.
bachelors
Yeah.
to marry.
Right.
And then at some point, it's going to be divorcees or widowers, right, who would marry you. And that fear was really instilled in us. And so, again, there wasn't a lot of guidance around educational aspirations.
Right.
And I think for me, it was just following my heart in terms of what classes did I enjoy.
Okay.
Gotcha. So you didn't go
Okay.
into college knowing.
I did not know. And in
Okay.
fact, I went into college with a business degree.
Okay.
And in fact, I was discouraged to go to college
Yeah.
because of the fact that I was a Hmong daughter.
Wow.
Not that my parents were not encouraging of schooling, but they wanted to also be like other Hmong communities.
Right.
Just like yeah.
Right. Yeah, of course, of course.
And of course, my parents were very loving, and I think that's why I was able to stay single. They didn't push me every day. It was the community members,
Yes.
the extended family
Yes.
members
Oh, yeah.
that were telling me these. My parents never did, right?
Yeah.
That dread every day.
Yeah,
oh,
yeah,
yeah.
you
And we
know,
see
now
that
I'm
so much.
We see
Yeah.
that in a
now
lot
I'm
of families.
18,
yeah.
now I'm 19, but my parents never really said that.
Yeah.
It was just
Yeah.
extended family members. And so I really enjoyed business classes because back in the days, they didn't have psychology classes in high school. It was all the other core classes. And so I had somehow convinced my parents to allow me to go to college 4 hours away, which was also unheard of back
Okay.
then. And when I told my dad that my major was business, my dad actually said to me, "Oh, 個有住我到好嚟喎，都話有啲住人呢，我冇平時咯，比如business 嗱。
Yeah.
Because even though my dad was very educated, he was also, part of the oppressed group.
Yeah,
right?
from a
Hmong
different
who were-
time.
Yeah, different times. And so he went to school with Laotians, but we were a minority.
Right.
And, our history with being a minority in China as well. So I think his mindset was always, you have to just go along with the dominant culture.
Right.
You have to live in harmony and adapt. And you don't ruffle the feathers with them. And you really just take what people give you and be grateful for that. And so that was his mindset, even though he was seen as someone who was doing great things, had achieved all these wonderful things. In his mind, he had been existing within a more dominant culture, which added to that oppressive narrative. And that's what he subconsciously passed on to me.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
He really wanted to protect me. But what came out was a reflection, a projection of his own internalized
Yeah.
narrative, which is, you can't do that. There's no support system to help you build your
Right.
business.
Right.
But I went in claiming, business anyway. But along the way, I realized I didn't enjoy those accounting classes, those macro, micro
Yeah.
accounting classes. And then I took a psychology class and I took an anthropology class. And I think that's the beauty of college. It just exposes you to the different courses, things that you were never exposed to,
Yep.
right? Ways of thinking that you were never exposed to. And I really enjoyed the anthropology class, and I really enjoyed the psychology class.
Yeah.
And it came easy to me. And at that point, then those reflections of childhood experiences kind of made the pieces fall into place, because I then remembered that as a teenager, whenever I went shopping with my sisters, I much more preferred to sit in the middle of the mall and watch passerbys and
Yeah.
really check out like how did those two people end up together?
Right.
And oftentimes I would take note of their shoes. I kind of have a fascination with feet and shoes.
Yeah.
My kids always make fun of me for that. And it's like, what made that person buy that shoe versus
Right.
that person buy that shoe? And so it just kind of, all of those moments that you never are aware of as a child, because you're not that reflective as a child, you're just kind of living through it, just came into place. And it's like, oh, I do enjoy understanding human behavior. I do enjoy the psychological component of what people do, why people choose what they choose. And the rest is history.
So how did you explain to your pops that you changed from business to psychology, and was it hard for him to understand that what that major entails, or how did you explain that? And then what was his questions as, like you said, of an older generation? What was his questioning to you about what is this degree?
Right.
What
Because
is
mental
psychology?
health wasn't always
And even-
as big as it is
Right,
now.
and we're talking 20
Yes.
five some years ago, right? So
Yes.
what was his reaction to you announcing that to him, and how did you explain it, or did you
Right.
maybe didn't explain
That's
it?
a great question. That's a
Yeah.
great question. And my memory is fuzzy on that.
Okay.
Part of it, the reason why it's fuzzy is because my parents are, they're not always verbally engaging. They're not
Sure.
the kind of parents that would sit down with you and have a conversation with you. They provide the basic necessities.
Right.
They love us. They really only engage with us when we're doing something that they disapprove of. So
Right.
if we're, back then I had my sisters and we traveled a lot more than most girls my age, my generation. And my mom would say, oh, it's or
Yeah.
my mom would say, oh, 你要煮包煮之後，你有一班菜小朋友食嘢，你請地係煮咗我。And that was the extent of our conversation. My dad never really said, well, when I went to school, it was this and this and this.
Right,
What are you
right.
studying?
Yeah.
And so that's why I don't remember if we even had that conversation.
Maybe it was just a silent transition
Yeah,
that you did on your own. Okay,
And it was
got you,
just,
got you.
Thank goodness she graduated, because I think they were worried
Yeah.
that I
Yeah,
wouldn't
yeah.
graduate.
Right.
Part of it is because when I was a senior, I don't remember having any of my peers as single females as well.
Yeah,
And so
yeah.
I think my dad, who can be progressive in his education, was also very traditional
Yes.
in the
Yeah.
way that he existed in the community. And so in his mind, he thought, 這就有冇諗到多西要嘅，
Yeah.
你冇嘅要住住知嘅要冇有紙嘅要個住啲嘅個要到窿俾 pay.
Yeah.
And so that was what he was more concerned about
Yeah.
rather than
Right.
the degree. And that
Right.
was what kind of held it together for me. And that was what, in many ways, because I was from that earlier, older generation,
Yeah.
in many ways, I didn't want my parents to have, a bad name or a loose face. And so it kept me in college, and it kept me committed to the college education and then graduating. So
Okay.
I don't
Yeah.
think my parents had that
Yeah.
question
No,
at all,
just-
which was
Maybe
all-
I'm
in a way,
thinking.
No.
Yeah.
I think that's a great question because I look at my wife now, and she's in her master's program, but me and her, we just have such stark, like so different ideas of it, and like for her, education is very important, and it's driven because of, I think, her parents, right? Her father and her mother are still around. They're still fairly young, so they still really push that onto her. And whereas like my father left early on, and I knew like I had to go to college, and I did what I needed to do to graduate. But like education is a big piece for her, and we even like waited until after college before we got married. And I think a lot of that stemmed from what you just said, was because I think she didn't, even today, she still, like, her father can get her to do things I can't, and so like it's still, I don't know if I would call it an issue. There's still those things happening today, right?
Yeah.
Even with this younger generation.
And I
where-
think it comes from your parents too, right? Because we have such variances of level. Well, okay, I want to be careful how I say this, but we
Yeah.
have variances in how strong your parents are with the culture, for
Yes.
example, right?
Yes.
For example, so like for example, for me, I grew up in France without Hmong people around.
Yeah.
So we were, and my parents, I think my dad arrived in France in 78, 79. So a little bit earlier than the big wave that came to Minnesota. And so my upbringing was not too influenced by Hmong culture. Versus my cousins who are my age, who came here, there's a difference in that. And so that's the hard part. I think that as Hmong people, we forget that every Hmong person, we have like a different experience with our own culture.
Each family
and
has
how
its own
conservative is, right? How
Yes.
conservative one might be,
Yes.
or how open-minded one might be,
Yes.
and then where you grew up. Because if you grew up in Vermont with no other Hmong people,
Yeah.
then you will assimilate to be probably somebody who you're not, Hmong becomes foreign to you, like me.
Yeah.
Yes, you're not
Hmong
as
to me was very
connected.
foreign to me when I first came here. And it still feels foreign now, even though I've been in Minnesota for 20 years. When I go somewhere and they Wanang, it's gotten easier, but
Yeah.
it's still, there's always a piece of it that's odd to me.
Yeah.
Because I never saw it in France. I didn't
Right,
grow up with
right.
it. My first 11 years were not, I had never seen that experience for the first 11 years.
Right.
And so when we talk across Hmong people, I think that sometimes, and I want you to speak on that if possible, is just that we forget that we're all a little bit different type of Hmong person, right? We're
Yeah.
Yes.
different parents and stuff like
Yeah.
that.
And I think you're right, because we tend to think that we're all homogeneous, right?
Yeah.
That we're all the
One
same,
people.
that we're
Yeah.
all refugees, and that we
Yeah.
all carry that narrative, and that we all have, exist within family systems that really value the collective peace, that really value education, that really value so on and so forth. And yet there are common threads, and I think that's
Right.
the part that gets overgeneralized,
Yeah.
saying we're
Yeah.
all the same. There are common threads, and we don't want to
Yes.
minimize that. But there are also unique differences. Like you said, the way in which we were raised kind of shapes the way that we look at the world. The regions in which we were raised kind of shapes the way that we look at the world. And so
Yeah.
we might think of Hmong, but my idea of Hmongness is very different than your idea of Hmongness and your idea of Hmongness, right? Depending on, like you said, the region in which we were raised and the community in which we were raised. Because I grew up in California, and we always had this idea of what Minnesotans were like.
Yeah.
Because they
I
were
wanna hear
different
about
that.
than where
Yeah.
we were in California. But even within our own family,
Yeah.
like my family is different than my sister's family.
Yeah.
Right.
Because of the values that we bring into it. And our values are always influenced by the experiences that we
Yeah.
have, by the experiences that our spouse has too. So
Right.
you're right, we are very heterogeneous. And
Yeah.
if we were to get into more like a clinical analysis of it, even the migration patterns, right? You going to France has somehow influenced your Hmong experience and
Oh,
the way
yeah,
that you
absolutely.
think about Hmong
Absolutely.
differently than us coming to the United States. Those who came in the 70s like us were like fresh, really true refugees.
Yeah. Because when you said because you did say that you mentioned 70s, and I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, that's the earlier, that's
Those
the,
Yeah,
are
that's
it's
the
like one of
first
the
wave.
first
Yeah.
waves.
Think about that, right? We fled in 75 and 78 we're here.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's like 3 years of the trauma of the
Yeah.
war.
Right.
The trauma from that exodus
Right.
out of Laos. We're truly refugees
Yeah.
in our mindset.
Yeah, yeah.
We did not have a chance to understand the bathroom system, the language system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My dad did, but none of us did, right? But then there were the waves that came later that may have had more of a different refugee mindset. But then you've got the ones that came from the Thai camp in the 2004 to 2006.
Yes.
They're not a refugee mindset anymore.
Yeah.
So
Right.
their Hmong experience is very different because they've been heavily influenced by Thai culture.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And then you've got those who are from international marriages who are here. They're also of a different mindset, and their culture is very different. So their idea of Hmongness is very different than our idea of Hmongness, too. And so I think we forget about that heterogeneous piece of it.
Yes.
And that's
And
why it's
I
good to
love that we're
highlight
talking
these.
about this
Yeah.
because we haven't talked about this before, and like you said, it's important that we remember that like being Hmong is a beautiful thing, but we have to. Well, I'm not gonna say we. I will speak for myself. I have to ensure that I stay open-minded to understand that every Hmong person I meet, because I have my own criticism and my own generalization of Hmong culture, right? We all have that. Like,
do.
we all have these, I'm not going to go to that funeral because, man, they're just going to be drinking. Oh, like, you think of these things,
Yeah.
but because maybe they're self-defense mechanisms that we all hold into ourselves, or maybe we just want to hold that, we want to put that judgment because it's simpler to put the judgment than put the thinking behind it. But, yeah, it's nice I think it's important just for me to remember that, hey, like you said, sit down, think. Every Hmong person is different. Everyone has a different background. Everyone grew up different dads. What generation? What
Right.
area?
Right.
Like there's so much more to
Yeah.
it.
And even more so now, where this generation wants to be seen as an individual.
Yes.
Right? Because
Yeah.
we're more leaning towards the individualized
Right.
values. And so everyone wants to be seen for who they are
Yes.
and for what they can bring to the table.
Mm-hmm,
But when we generalize them as all Hmong, many of them have some very strong reactions to that.
Yeah.
Because they've probably grown up as a collective.
Right.
And they're really trying to battle through that identity, realization or recognition of how come I'm not being seen for who I am.
Right.
So this is a great reminder to all of us because we're humans and we do exist and interact with people from our own framework.
Right. Yes.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
that's just because we're humans.
Right.
But as long as we're open to constantly reminding ourselves
Yeah.
of that awareness.
I did have one question. So when we're talking about like being mindful of staying aware, and maybe this is more of a clinical type question, but it's do you see in your experience that like, for example, I'm going to talk about probably like more the first generation Hmong that were here, the ones that are late 50s, 60s and above. Have you noticed, based from your experience, does the mind become harder in its ability to be malleable and flexible as it gets older from your experience or through the studies that you've done?
Yeah.
Because it always seems like when we want to change our parents, or not,
Yeah.
I don't want to say change our parents, but we try to explain to them and they just
Yeah.
don't want to listen to it or they don't want to understand it. And we've all felt that.
Yeah. Almost
We all feel
yeah.
that, I think, as just children in general, but us even more because our parents come from the culture, so they have a lot of the influence, and they always talk about the influence that they've had.
Yeah.
And we try to tell them, no, like this, it's like this, and like
Yeah.
this, and we think like this, and maybe we're just kids, and we're like, they don't want to understand. But is there some scientific evidence as well of any kind that,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
as you get older, maybe the mind is harder
Great
to?
question.
Yeah.
It's
To
a great
restructure?
question. Yeah, and That reminds me of, right, the old saying, you can't teach an old dog new tricks,
Yeah.
right? But actually, the research is constantly changing.
Sure.
And that's why I try to be very fluid, even though we can be very scientific based. Sometimes science changes. And
Yeah.
back in the days, years ago, we used to believe that your brain stops growing after a certain age. And so to your question, we used to believe that, yeah, you can't teach an old dog new tricks.
Like, what was that age back in the day that they would say, like, oh, around 35, the brain's
Yes, like an adult.
somewhere in that
adult-
range. Okay, okay.
Yes. And yet the new research is showing that your brain never stops growing.
Okay.
And so there's this term called neuroplasticity.
Yep.
And neuroplasticity just means that your brain, there's these axons that are constantly firing, and the axons that you're not firing, they could just kind of die down. They just kind of die off. But if you're learning new skills and you're
Right.
constantly learning your new skills, your brain can learn new skills even
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
you're older. And so that neuroplasticity just means that you just keep doing that same thing over and over again, and after a while, that wire just gets lit up. And then it becomes a new skill. And so anybody can learn new skills. Anybody can learn new ways of thinking if they're open to it. And that's the key thing. When you're talking about my generation and older generations, the thing is that they have lived their life so convicted in the values and in the patterns because it's helped them to survive. So when you think about, we often talk about survival mode when we
Yeah.
think about our Hmong people because of the trauma during the Vietnam War, that historical trauma piece. And so if what I have done have kept me alive, then I'm going to continue to do that.
Right.
Because that is what has really kept me through and through and helped me through and through. So when you're asking older generations to change, it's that stubbornness and also that really deeply ingrained belief system.
Okay.
It's the belief system. So when you think about if we go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper, for all of us, it's always our belief system that either propels us
Yep.
to change or holds us back.
Sure.
from
Like
changing.
our core value about change, for example.
Yes.
A core value about change. Are you a person that says, I'm able to change whenever if I put my mind to it, versus someone that says, this is what I've been taught and I can try to change, but chances are it won't. And it's
It
like
won't work. Yes,
exactly.
Yes. And even to the change that you're talking about, I think agency, like you can control things, you can do things. I think you sort of insinuated that
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
this generation.
With age, yeah.
And you think about my generation, older generation, we were raised on a very traditional model of what we call fatalism. Fatalism is a term that says that our life circumstances are predetermined, right? You guys speak Hmong?
Yeah, no, I do understand that,
Yeah.
but that one I would like for you to break, unless you,
Yeah.
can you explain that one?
It's
that
this
one I would
idea
like a
that,
breakdown.
Your book is written for you prior to your birth, right?
But the way you-
So
Yeah,
you
yeah,
have,
yeah,
yes, that
They're
is it.
predetermined
So you have
fate,
a
yeah.
visa. So there's already a visa that you've been given prior to being born
Sure.
on Earth. And so the Hmong people traditionally believe that anything that happens to you in this lifetime was already
So
predetermined.
it's almost
Yeah.
like a little bit of I'm using a French word here, so laissez-faire, like a let it be
Yes,
type
yes,
personality.
yes, it's your
Okay.
fate.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
your fate. So there's already that fate that's been written already, and so you can't really do much to control
Sure.
it.
Yeah.
And yet here we are in America, where it not only is it more individualistic, but it's also free will and determinism, which means that you have a choice. You
Yeah.
can choose to go this way or that way. And so this younger generation are seeing their parents maybe wallowing in misery. Maybe
Right.
they're in a really
Right.
bad marriage. Maybe they're in, a really bad situation. And this generation is saying, Mom, Dad, you can do this. You can do
Right.
that.
Yeah.
And the parents are just like, oh,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so it just frustrates this generation. And while yes, it's possible for the older generation to change, can they or do they choose to?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
sometimes they
Sure.
don't.
And on an
It's too
individualistic level. Now, what can our generation do then? Is there a suggestion that what we can do, or do we just be more patient with our parents, or? how do we deal with that, right? Because my parents are kind of in the middle, I think. But how do we deal with that when we have an uncle, for example? Well, I wouldn't even say uncle, because uncle's kind of far away. Sometimes uncle will be uncle, you let him be.
Yeah.
But like for your parents, for example, how does our generation deal with that? Do we just learn to be more patient? Do we?
Yeah.
Because that's kind of hard, right?
It's a complicated question.
Okay.
And the
Yeah.
reason why it's a complicated question is it depends, right? It always depends because there's layers and layers and layers of variables, whether it's cultural, whether it's interpersonal, whether it's mental health. And so I'll kind of give like maybe a general question with knowing that there are a lot of exceptions to the rules. But if, for example, when you said, do we just accept them for who they are? Yes, that is a good approach if it's not harming your well-being.
Sure. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So sometimes parents are stubborn. They still love you. The Shima, it's just harder for them to change because they've been acclimated to this way of doing things. And to ask them to change is to ask them to give up everything that they've always known. Whether it's good or bad, it's what has formed their identity. And we know that change, even good change, is hard for us, right? Moving to a new house, even if it's a bigger house, and there's so many exciting things about it, we have to grieve the old house.
Right.
We have to grieve some of the things that we were accustomed to. And so when you think about older folks who don't really see themselves as resilient, who has this more oppressive nature, oppressive narrative, right, that's been internalized for generations, when you're asking them to change, and you see ahead is like lots of good things. Ahead is just like the sun is shining, but they just can't do it. A lot of it is probably mental health as well, but a lot of it is also fixed beliefs that they cannot work through. But they still show up for you. Yeah, they're not as engaged with you, but they're also not abusive.
Right.
And,
Right.
And they might nag on you a lot, but it's because they don't want you to, get into trouble. They worry about you. So, so they're very annoying, perhaps, but it comes from a place of love. Then in that way, then yes, you love them.
Yeah.
Because then you have to work on your own well-being so that you can show up for them.
Right.
And really show compassion for why they show up the way they do and why they don't show up the way they do, right?
Yeah.
And so in that way, yes, to your question, it's probably a lot better to just shower them with love, understanding, and compassion because they are doing their very best. But in the cases where you've got parents who are very negative, who are abusive,
Right.
who have really toxic traits or negative energy, and it just brings you down anytime you're with them. You just feel so horrible about yourself. In those situations, then I don't know how you can accept them, but you have to do a lot more work on yourself.
Right.
And a lot more work on boundary building. And you have to do a lot of reflections on how much do you show up for them and how much do you not show up for them.
Sure.
And a lot on how much do you give space without feeling guilty.
Right.
Because sometimes guilt is a big part of your generation's struggle too, is you want to be that good child. You want to be that good daughter, that good son, that good daughter-in-law, that good son-in-law. But it's hard to show up as your authentic self because when you show up as that, all they have are maybe negative words.
Right.
Because their values are so different.
Yeah.
And so that's why you have to kind of talk about all the different variables.
Yeah.
It's really hard.
Yeah. How does this clash of culture, how does that play out in young people? How has it affected our younger generation?
It is very, it does affect our younger generation. We are seeing at our clinic younger clients who are Hmong-Americans who are coming in and talking a lot about their identity struggles.
Right.
That whole being stuck between wanting to do what their parents are asking them to do because everybody wants to be a good son, a good daughter. Nobody wants to be a son and a daughter who, disrespects their parents. Everybody wants to respect their parents and show up in a good way, but we aren't always successful because we have our own emotional response to our parents, right?
Yeah.
But so how it shows up is they struggle with the guilt. If I choose me and I separate myself from my parents, then I feel like I'm neglecting my parents. I
Right.
feel like I'm not living out my parents' dream. But if I live out my parents' dream, then I feel like I'm losing me and I'm
Yeah.
unhappy. And so this generation is feeling like they have to choose either or. And I think that comes from mixed messaging. We were just having this conversation, I think it was yesterday when I was doing a training on the mixed messaging that younger adults are having right now from parents. It's like, I want you to be successful in school,
Right.
but I also want you to be a good daughter and son. 哥哥保仔，哥哥要做冇嗰啲，幾耐嘅後家要做到冇，佢要做碌幾啲呢咋？但係咪要做到少年咯？要做冇咁大咪要做，我等我，就是到這咪到咋，出日頭 right？
Yeah.
So it's like at home we want you to be that that valued daughter and son who really respects the elders, who isn't always voicing your opinion. Do what you're told. Know your role in the family. But we want you to also be assertive, and we want you to also work hard so you can climb the corporate ladder so that you can have an education. And they're like, what? On one hand, you're telling me to do this, and on the other hand, you're telling me to do that. They're really confused because parents themselves are giving messaging that they don't realize is confusing.
Right.
And feel mixed.
Yeah.
Because part of that, and I'll say a little bit more about why that is, part of that is because the way that the parents were parented existed in a different community in Laos.
Right.
Yeah, different
Where the
place, different time.
infrastructure,
Yeah.
right, the social infrastructure, and different time and place, where the social infrastructure really was of the collective, really was of the harmonious way in which we exist, really was of we each have our own role to fulfill within those families. And what was valued, what was honorable, was how we fulfill those roles. And so even though parents are like, oh, we had that collective to keep us accountable, maybe, or we had that collective to inform the pieces that our parents didn't actually tell us. Whereas in America now,
Right.
they're still parenting us that way, but the social infrastructure is different. So that collective piece isn't there. So we're still parenting our kids with minimal advice, minimal directions, and they're confused because they can't connect the dots.
Right.
Because the infrastructure isn't helping them to connect the dots.
Yeah.
Right.
Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah,
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 yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Does this play out in other cultures too? Just because I tend to think individualism is like this really Western
That's
ideal,
exactly where I
right?
was gonna
But
go
when
with
we
that,
think
yeah.
about like Eastern cultures,
Right.
like even in China, like they operate as a collective. The Hmong community operated as a collective. How does that play out? And I guess in other cultures that's maybe has spent more time here in the West, that's originally from the East.
Yeah, so you're talking to like migration patterns,
Yeah.
and whether or not they've shifted
Yeah.
and adopting more individualistic.
Right. Yeah. Because I just think of like, I think, early like Chinese and Japanese settlers, they've been here in the West for a long time, and I think they've kind of adopted that a lot more so. And then now we have like, Hmong people or like people that's kind of recently migrated, and we still kind of struggle with that. And I always look at other cultures like Korean culture where they have been here for longer, and I see that, or how do we continue to uphold this idea of what Hmongness, right?
Yes, that's
as
a
we
good question.
as we come into more, I don't know,
Of
more
this individualistic
individualism.
culture,
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
losing some of the collectivism that we were,
Yeah.
like you said, they taught us because when they lived in the jungles of Laos and not just that, but a chaotic wartime, you have to be collective in that trauma. Versus now we have been raised with all of our basic needs have been met, and so your question is, how do we deal with?
I guess how do we preserve our culture,
Yes.
and then
okay,
how
okay.
has
Yes.
has other
Yes. I hear what
groups
you're saying.
of Asian and Asian Americans, like how have they fared with it?
Yeah, how do we preserve the Hmongness that
Yeah.
that
In
is
the Western
highly
world,
valued
yeah.
and still adapt? To, yeah, I think what you guys are doing is one good example. It's starting to have those conversations and creating a new normal for us. because I think the younger generation, what they really reject is this belief that we have to exist the way that we always have. And the reason why they reject that is because what they see are some of the negative features of our Hmongness, right?
That's true.
The you have to show up to a feast. You
Yeah.
have to do this. You
Yeah.
have to
Yeah.
do that, right? And the oppressive nature of the patriarchy, which is, women may have less rights than men do, and you have to just honor your husband, and all of these negative things are what shows up first, because that's what we remember.
Yeah.
That's what we emotionally react to. And so when we do that, there's a lot of dismantling that needs to be done. And when we say that, we think we're going to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? But,
Yeah.
but that's not what we're trying to do. And your question is saying, how do we sift through this so that we still can keep the Hmongness of
Yes.
us, but then that we are not afraid to adapt to the American piece of who we are? And that's a really good question, and it's different for every person, right? But the main point is to adopt things that are going to be healthy for us. So from a individualistic perspective, it's really important to choose a career that you have passion about, that you enjoy, that you're naturally good at, so it doesn't feel like work. And even if that career is something that is not what your parents want,
Yeah.
even if it's a career that might not bring honor to their name, right? Doctor, lawyer, all of that, that it's still a career that gives you value and gives you joy, and that that you're growing in and you're thriving in. And so that's the American piece, right? Whereas some people might choose to go into medical school. They don't love it, but it's for their parents.
Yeah.
They're
Oh, yeah.
suffering and they're compromising
Yep.
that. And so that individualistic piece is, as long as it's not bad, no matter
Yeah.
what career you have, as long as you're thriving in it, you're making your own money, you're paying your own bills, then that's okay.
Yeah.
You don't have to carry the burden of
Yeah.
bringing, like honor to your family.
It is, but it is. There is a lot of influence in the Hmong community, I think, and this is just from my perspective, my view of my upgrowing. But like your uncles and stuff like that, like the message is it's kind of similar, right? It's like you said, education, doctor, like that umbrella to me really does exist. And when I wasn't doing good in school and stuff like that, it wasn't just my parents who were giving me grief about it. It was my entire family.
The whole clan.
The whole clan.
Yeah.
Until I went and did my own things my way. I didn't go to college. I never graduated. I, went to the service, fire department. I did my own thing. And then all of a sudden your uncles and aunties are like, hey, good job doing all that.
Yeah.
But there was always that cultural pressure. Even now my mom is still like, hey, you should go back to school, blah, blah, blah. And I'm
Yeah.
like, but that's not, I like to study
Yeah.
based on my passion, and that's how I
Yeah.
operate. But I don't know, because let's ask you, because you didn't have your father growing up.
Yeah.
Did you still feel that Hmong pressure as a culture that you have to do these things like college and?
Oh yeah, definitely. Because I've spoken on this before, like on the podcast. But like, I went to school because I thought that was the right thing to do. I went and got a career where I was wearing suit and tie, Monday through Friday. And, I thought that would make my mother
Do you think
very
it was
proud.
more? Okay, so do you think it was more for you, or do you think it was more for?
I think it was more for them because I
Okay.
found now in my later 20s
Yeah.
that my mother, although she was very happy, she also didn't care. And she was more like, hey, dude, I think, and then I made a career switch. I eventually left my career to start my farm. And I saw how happy that made her, and I think she saw how happy that made me. And we come from a very less than traditional family, just because my father left very young, and so I didn't go to like these Hmong things at all, because essentially it's like you go and you help your father and you help their side,
Right.
but because that was absent. I didn't grow up with this idea of what Hmongness. It was all around me because I grew up here in Minneapolis. It was all around me, but like I still feel the same way you feel when I go to some of these events where I'm kind of like, what's going on? Like, but yeah, like I went to school. I did that for, I graduated college. I got a job. I did that for my mother, and I did that for, I guess, everybody else but myself. Eventually, I got tired of it, and when I got enough courage, I was like, all right, I'm going to get out of here and do something that I enjoy.
Yeah.
And that was like very, what's the word? Very enlightening, you know?
And maybe fulfilling.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Validating.
Fulfilling is
Yeah.
a big word.
Yeah.
And all these
Yes, we.
warm and
Yes,
fuzzy words.
exactly.
Yeah. But you guys bring up a really good point, though, and it just reminds me of this saying again that we always want what we don't have, right?
Yes.
And so as I'm hearing you guys talk about your generation, and I'm thinking about my generation, it's like, gosh, my generation was don't go to college, get married. Don't go to college, get married.
Okay.
Study
Really?
hard, but only to a certain age, and then get married because then you're going to be an old maid. And so I really envy your generation where it's like, go to college, right?
Yeah.
But I hear that you guys are like, that's like so much pressure, and it's never ideal. No matter what generation we grow up in, there's always something that we're gonna not want because we always want what we don't have.
I think that's
Yeah.
important to highlight that it's never ideal.
Yeah.
It's
We
never
have
ideal.
to make the best of it, right? Because
Exactly.
for my generation, I had to fight hard to go to college.
Mm-hmm.
And I think to your point earlier, even if you're going against the grain,
Mm-hmm.
as long as you are doing good,
Mm-hmm.
then at some point the community, the family members will go because they aren't always visionaries. They are only
Right.
visionaries
Yes.
of what they can see, and sometimes it's only their own life. Sometimes it's only culture.
And didn't grow up
Yeah.
individualistic culture, American
Yes,
capitalism,
yes.
all those things.
Yes,
Yeah.
and so they are parenting you with the best tools that they
Yes.
have,
Yeah.
saying
Security.
because to them that is the easiest route. That is the route that's going to give you a fulfilled life.
Yeah.
But you may not want that because school, it's not for me.
It's never-
but you're
yeah.
also saying, I'm not going to just bum around.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not just going to, not do anything with my life, but I'm not going to take the conventional route.
Right.
And you do your thing, and you're going to start to have those fruits of your labor, even though it's unconventional, and they're
Yeah.
going to turn around and they're going to start to say, oh, he's kind of an outstanding guy.
Yeah.
He didn't choose a traditional route, but look at him.
Yeah.
He's got all of these accolades. He's got all of these, fruits of his labor that is also respectable.
Yeah.
And that's why your uncle probably has come around to
Yeah.
maybe say
Yeah.
encouraging words. Because in my mind, back then, the values, and going back to your first question, I don't want to neglect that about the first Hmong speaking licensed psychologist. You don't really set out to be the first of
Right.
anything,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
You just do it because you have a conviction. You just do it because you understand yourself enough, and it's not what the world is telling you. But it's also not in self-destructive ways either.
Yes.
So my choice to go to college was frowned upon because they were afraid I was going to be an old maid and not having anyone to marry me that would be a single bachelor, which is the honorable thing. My choice to go to college, even though it went against all of that, I knew what I was doing.
Right.
I knew that I wasn't drinking and doing drugs. I knew that I wasn't doing anything negative. I was doing something good, even though I didn't get the support of my community. I had my eye on the goal, and I was okay with going against the grain.
Yeah.
And I remember there was a party. Well, I won't go into details about
Yeah.
it. But I remember.
If you want to, yeah, we'd love to hear about it.
Our audience also parties. So
Yeah.
Well, and this was not that kind of party, but I remember going to a feast, let's say, and there were people there judging me because I was single and I was in college.
Really?
Yes, they were like, oh, lo, all this stuff. And I remember thinking to myself, I know my goal. It doesn't matter what people say to make me feel bad.
Yeah.
I know my goal. I know where I'm headed. And I kept to my goal. And here we are, I'm 52, right? And I live a completely different life than my 52-year-old counterparts who got
Yeah.
married when they were in middle school,
Yeah.
high school. And I'm okay with that. And I ended up marrying a bachelor Hmong guy anyway,
Yeah.
who was probably going through his own journey.
Yeah.
Because when you're growing up, you kind of grow up in your isolated community. You don't know that there are other people out there. You just stick to your convictions, and you just know that your convictions are good for you, and they're honorable, and people might not see it now, but you're not doing
Yeah.
self-damaging things that would bring
Yeah.
dishonor. And I think that goes back to your point about what you chose to do, where it's
Yeah.
still bringing honor to
And,
your
and I
family.
think but I think that can be hard for, let's say, a teenager, like
Yeah.
a teenager that's about to be, like, let's say somebody's listening to this who he or she is a senior in high school, about to sign up. Hey, you got to go to college now. What major would you like to choose? And maybe your conviction is not strong yet. Maybe your
Yeah.
conviction is not strong yet. So, because I think you're fortunate if your conviction is strong.
Yeah.
That's a fortunate thing in my mind, because that guy always knew what he was going to do. She always knew what she wanted to do. And maybe that's an outside perspective, but I do feel like some people also do know. Like
Yeah.
they do have a conviction, like you said, the word conviction of what they might want to do. You know, what do we say to the ones that don't have that conviction? Because now you got to meddle around, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And now you're floating in space, and other people will tell you, no, you got to pick something. But then it makes you unhappy. You go to college
Right.
and you're like, man. So
Yeah. I would say, I know this is a question for you, but I would say until you find that conviction, maybe listen to your parents. Because if
Yeah.
I didn't go to
Yeah.
college, maybe I'd be
'Cause it helped
off.
you too,
Yeah, because
right?
it opened so
It
many
helped
different
you too,
doors.
right? So-
right. But at the same time, like, yeah, it can also put you in a bad spot. I'm still paying off loans. But also like so this like intergenerational conflict, is that at the end of the day inevitable? Just because like I have children now, like
yeah,
we're always gonna clash.
they're Gen A. They're Gen A,
Right?
not
Yeah.
like you.
I mean,
are.
you guys clashed
Yeah.
over, you and your parents clashed over something different
Right.
than me and Two's parents may have clashed.
Right.
And then me and my children are going to clash, right? So it's almost like unavoidable.
inevitable.
It's
yeah.
inevitable.
Because we only, again, we see the world through our
Through
own
our
lens.
lens.
So when I was younger, people would say, oh, at some point you're gonna like be so disconnected from this younger generation, you won't know what's
Yeah.
woke, what's cool.
Yeah.
I'm like, nah, that won't
Yeah.
happen to me. And I have 3 kids, and my 2 older ones are in college, and boy, do we not see eye to eye.
Yeah, I bet. Oh, I want to hear about that.
I'm
Yeah.
outdated.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
they're, and we disagree on a lot of things. Even though I think that I am doing the best parenting possible, I'm giving them advice. I'm giving them guidance. Like my oldest now is looking for an internship. And we're like on her. We're like, okay, have you looked for an internship?
Yeah.
It's going to be good for you. And she's like, Mom, I'm going to do it on my own way. And she's like, well, this one internship, I don't want to apply for it because they're not paying me, because I have to know my worth. And if they're a huge company and they're not paying me,
Yeah.
why would I feed into that? I'm just
Yeah.
like enabling that kind of systemic
Yeah.
abuse of little people. And
Yeah.
and we're like, no. You're starting out. You have to.
Yeah.
You can't demand that,
Yeah.
because that you're just starting. You just have to be thankful you have an opportunity, and then that's your foot in the door. And we disagree so much, and she thinks we're like on her, and she
Yeah.
wants to hold on to her convictions,
Yeah.
and so you're right, it's inevitable. But I think the key is, are we open-minded to have
Right.
these conversations so that we can understand where they're coming from, so that they can understand where we're coming from,
Yeah.
and so that we can give each other grace and space to honor what they're doing within their generation. Because I have to admit, as much as I work with a lot of my clients who are from my kids' generation, it is still very hard for me to understand that generation, because my values are really ingrained. Back to your point, some of these values are so deeply ingrained, and I believe in it so much that it's hard for me to adapt and adopt
Yeah.
this younger generation's values. And that's where I think the generational conflict comes
Yeah.
in. But we have to just give them grace and say, you know what, they'll figure their way through life. We have to trust that we've built a strong enough foundation
Right.
in their
Right.
early years.
The core of it, yeah.
Yeah, those core values. And I think part of this, going back to your question too about about what if kids don't know? What if they're not convicted?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's because they're having to struggle through too many layers of self-doubt, a lot of mental health struggles, maybe anxiety, worries. Maybe life hasn't always been what they want. And yes, some of it is hardwiring, but there's just a lot of factors too that
Yeah.
they might feel lost in life.
Yeah,
And
I
so
think
that
that's
guidance is good.
I think that's why Ping and I. So when we first started this podcast, we talked about like it's going to be about mental health because he's been in therapy, I've been in therapy, and we're having this conversation with you. And this is the sort of conversation that we have in therapy, right?
Yeah.
We're like, hey, let's break down these layers and all that. But and that's why I think I'm such a proponent for it is because these conversations are not always had, unfortunately. And that's why I think we are such fan of it because it's like that's how you learn about yourself. There's many ways to learn about yourself. For me, it's been when I was younger, it was always physical, right? It was go work out and see how it hurts. The Marine Corps, oh, it's tough. Boom, all that stuff. But as I grew to my mid-20s, firefighting, seeing a lot more trauma, it was like, oh, now I get new problems. And so therapy really unlocked a new door for me where it was like, oh, when somebody else asks you inquisitive questions about you that your mom's not going to ask you, your dad's not going to ask you that, your sister's not going to ask you that, your friends don't ask you that because they're your friends. The therapist will ask you, the psychologist, they'll ask you stuff that makes you open up, and it's really helpful.
Yeah, and a lot of times, like in my experiences with therapy, like my therapist is great. Like he's never like telling me how to do it or what to do it. He's always asking questions, and then a lot of times it clicks in my head, because I'm talking about it, and I realize sometimes as I'm saying it out loud, like, oh, this is crazy. Like, why am I, like this is crazy that I doubt myself, or this is crazy that I'm thinking this way. So like that's why I'm a big proponent for it too, because it's like you're forced to engage in some of these conversations that you don't normally have. And to think about things and to say things out loud. And sometimes, when you say things out loud, you realize, oh, this is crazy. Yeah.
Do you find that with the older than you, I'd say even, sorry, I just essentially said that you're old.
Yeah.
I don't mean that.
I am.
Older.
I have to embrace my elder status.
Yeah, good. But for the older men, when especially in the Hmong culture, right? When you've addressed the topic, do you find that it's kind of receptive? Is it defensive, or is it? That's not even a thing. Like from your angle, with the older Hmong men, do we have a chance with them when it comes to mental health? I guess is my question.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to thank you both for sharing your personal story about going into therapy. Thank you for being vulnerable and just sharing that. And making it okay. Because oftentimes it's so stigmatizing when we talk about mental health, when we talk about going into therapy, because people have this idea that you've got to be losing your balls to go into therapy.
You're going crazy.
You know, you're not normal, you're just someone who's like not functional, and that's why you're going to therapy. And here you are, two outstanding young men who are...
I don't know about that, but
who are doing great things in the community, who are comfortable under your own skin, right?
Yeah.
Because we all have our strengths and we all have our flaws. And we have to embrace that. And for you you realize, yes, we're doing amazing things in this area, but we're struggling in these areas. And that's okay. That makes us human. And so you're both in therapy. Thank you for sharing about that. And people will look at you and say, oh, therapy isn't for the ostracized. Therapy isn't for the dysfunctional. Therapy is for people who want to continue to learn and grow and to be better. Because growth is an infinite process. It's a lifetime process. And so thank you for sharing about that, because then we're now normalizing therapy as well, too. That when you go into therapy, it really is about being open to different doors opening, which is our own self-awareness, right? Now you're talking about self-awareness as being a tool to just obtaining more life skills, to accessing things that we never thought existed. Because the truth is that a lot of Hmong clients who come, and a lot of clients in general who come into therapy, sometimes they're very insightful. Sometimes they're very psychologically minded. Sometimes they're not because they've suppressed all of those things that have harmed them, that has hurt them for years, and they come in and they don't know where to begin. All they know is that they're stuck. And that's where, as therapists, we have to really ask those questions, right? Because we have this framework of human behavior, and so we kind of know some theories, some hypotheses, and so we ask questions to kind of help you get unstuck. And sometimes that does open those portals to these aha moments. And then for folks like the two of you, where you're psychologically minded, you're open, you're receptive, you're not stuck, and you come in and you have already those skill sets because you're highly functional, you just know there are blind spots, let's say, and you come in and again, it helps you to engage in a deeper, higher functioning process by which to access those deeper insights that were blind spots. Because we all have blind spots, and our blind spots are created by our emotional reactions. So that's why we probably have more blind spots with people that we're more intimate with. And not in a physical form, but in an emotional form. So when we fight with our spouses, we have so many blind spots, don't we?
Yes.
When we fight with our children, when we fight with our parents, our siblings, because those emotional pieces, blind us.
Yeah.
And so I think to your question about the older generation, because we have been taught to suppress our emotions, we're still in that moment of feeling stuck and not knowing and keeping it there. Because we've not had the practice of talking about our feelings.
Sure.
Because the messaging is that talking about your feelings is also a weakness. But you have to, right? You have to show those emotions. And so when you have had generations and years of doing that, it's a skill set you lack. How do you pick that up?
Yeah.
So how do you develop that? I mean, that's my, I guess now it makes me think. So how do you develop that if it's a door that is like there's almost no key to it, but in a way there is a key, but that's kind of I mean that's very complex.
It's possible.
Very complex.
Some of it is personality. If you're more stubborn, if you just want what you want, then of course the door is going to be closed forever. Right? And I often think about this as, because gardening is such a big part, so a lot of analogies are very culturally specific, and so I think about gardening, and if you think about an older man, let's say, who's, you guys know what that means?
Yeah.
Like the foundation.
If the soil is already like rock solid hard, you can't plant a seed. There's no way that you can plant a seed and it'll grow. But to be vulnerable, to be open-minded is to allow the soil to be like tilled so that it's softer. And so when you allow the soil to be tilled, then you can plant a seed. And so a lot of our stubborn ways as older generations, especially males, who also come from a place of privilege. Now think about this. And I'm all over the place because it's complicated. When you think about Hmong men, they come from a place of privilege. And people who come from a place of privilege, why would you want change?
Right.
Change.
You're already
gonna
good.
lose that privilege,
Exactly.
Right? And so that ground is going to be solid.
Double layers.
Double
layers.
I like things the way they are. And so what we're asking these Hmong men is change things for the better. They're like, no, things are great for me. Why should I? And I don't need to. So the soil is rock solid, so you cannot plant that seed. But there are a lot of Hmong men now where we're doing a little chipping here and there, a little chipping there, a little chipping there, so that they can kind of see, oh, wait a minute, it doesn't feel as bad, and then we can plant that seed.
I love that analogy of the soil. Because that is, and it's very relatable to Hmong because just traditionally, I love that analogy. Well, let's see, what was I going to go?
I think that's a great analogy because, like, I'm in that field now, and I'm
you're a farmer.
I'm a farmer.
You're a
I'm
farmer,
a gardener.
so for you, it makes sense.
And I would say, like, to almost add on to that analogy, it's like instead of like chipping away, something to make the ground more fertile, right? Adding
How do you do
fertilizers,
that?
right? Adding compost, right?
Yeah.
So maybe not chipping away at their hardened soil skin.
I
Adding
love that.
information.
Adding
Adding
information
information,
that's
knowledge.
going to
That's
help.
less
That's a good way of looking at it.
invasive and
Yeah.
less scary.
That's
Yeah.
true.
You're enhancing it.
It's
and
not
enriching
as
it.
not as violent, right? It's
Yeah,
just
yeah,
like
yeah.
it's like I'm just giving you
Yeah,
information,
and
data.
regenerative
nurturing.
culture is like the new, or regenerative agriculture is the new thing, right? Adding things into the soil instead, or adding natural things into the soil instead of tilling it and
Right.
and taking away.
And that
But-
is
so
definitely.
sorry, we're
No, I
getting
love-
into the
thank-
weeds of
Thank you
garden.
for adding that, though.
That's
because
good.
I think that is less scary, and that is allows for more receptivity because it is really just in a nurturing, loving
Yeah.
way.
Yes.
Yeah.
Instead of in a locking horns kind of way.
Yes.
Or to think about the actual
Yes.
behavior of it. And so going back to your question earlier about how do we just accept our parents? What do? We add nurture
Yes.
and loving. So, one thing that often comes up is this generation is very much about YOLOing, right? You only live once, so live your best life. And so they're spending their money on vacations, experiences, maybe even on, materialistic things. And the older parents' generation just don't get that.
Yeah.
And so sometimes the really loving kids will say, Mom, Dad, do you want to go to Florida?
Yeah.
We'll pay for a trip to Florida.
Yeah.
Thinking that life experiences is really going to help them, right? And some parents are like, why would we spend money on that? Why are you always spending money? But if you keep loving them, and if Florida is too far of a stretch because it's flying and all that stuff, go to Duluth.
Right.
And that's the enriching that you're talking
Yeah.
about is you really take them away for maybe just Saturday. Start small.
Right.
And then they begin to realize, time away from home and time with my adult children is actually really nurturing of my soul.
Mm-hmm.
And then they become more receptive to this.
Yeah.
Right.
And then soon enough, you're going to Florida for a whole week with your parents,
Yeah.
right? To the
Yeah.
beach and to those Logan farms and to Disney World. And we're seeing that shift. We're seeing that some parents are more open-minded.
Yeah.
And it might be parents like yours and mine who are less married to their values and their beliefs of the old days, who are more just loving and nurturing, who are like your mom, as long as you do something with your life and you're happy, it makes me happy.
Yeah.
Versus you have to bring honor to my name.
Right.
You sako kutombe, and these
Yeah.
are people that are still very connected to that. And
Yeah.
those are the challenging ones. But some parents are now just saying, as long as you're happy, I'm happy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I always say like I'm very privileged in that sense, and it's sad to say that like divorce, like we were divorced from the culture, and then but yeah, it's a sucky thing to say, but like it was almost like a good thing because then it allowed us and it allowed our family, although it was like very traumatizing and hard for us growing up, but then we broke away from a lot of those like very traditional and maybe more toxic.
So you were
things.
more individualistic very early on.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Which helped
yeah.
you in this
It
setting.
gave you
in the-
permission
Yes.
to explore who you are
Yep,
without the
100%.
confines of the moment.
Yeah.
totally.
And I feel the exact same way, but then there's times when you do feel the opposite side, where it's like, where you're made fun of because you don't understand these pieces of the culture,
Yeah.
and then you feel bad about it yourself, like, or either feel bad. For me, it's always been, it makes me clash heads, like,
Yeah.
oh, you don't think I know Hmong? Fine, then I'm not even gonna care to know
Yeah, you
anything
pull
about
away
it.
from
Then,
it.
yeah, I don't want anything to know
Yeah.
about it then, because if that's your mentality behind it, then I'm not fine, whatever. So, like
Yeah.
you said, there's good and double-edged sword in some areas.
Because
yeah.
like we talked about this on the podcast, but like because we don't always attend family events. Bit more like we're breaking away from this this mold, right, of or this umbrella. But now, as we get older, some of these conversations come back up, or some of these questions come back up. Like, okay, we don't have this family structure anymore. It allowed us to be more individual, but now who's going to do our funeral? Who's going to be
Right.
there?
Yes.
When we
Yeah.
reach some of these like
Yeah,
points in our lives.
Where
And so
who do
it's
we
like-
reach to? Yeah,
Yeah.
at that point, because I think about that too. Like, what's my funeral gonna look like in who knows when? What's it gonna look like? Because I'm not that connected to the culture. So
Yeah.
these are and there's a challenging questions I think that we just have as like a child of immigrant parents and dealing with all these,
Yeah.
and that's I guess in one thing that can be probably a feeling that is shared by the Hmong community,
Yeah.
especially all the ones in America,
Yes.
is
Well-
we're dealing with two different worlds here.
But we have to think about us as human beings, and human beings exist within relationships, right? And so, yes, you might be disconnected from the Hmong community in some
Right.
ways, but you're also connected to your support system and building those relationships. And so, at some point, we have to just really honor those relationships that we build, as long as we show up with love and with authenticity. So back to your point about how, you know, being more separated from the Hmong culture has given you permission to be more free in choosing your career, in living your life. And then here comes these funerals, and now you're
Yeah.
to help you. But that's where you have to really assess yourself and say, how do I show up with love? And if I'm doing my own life, but if my relatives are also loving, how do I pour back into that?
Yeah. You got to bring them cash.
So that you have to kind of connect the two.
Yeah.
Because we are still Hmong.
Yes.
And we do still
Yeah.
exist within that. And sometimes Hmong people reject Hmong because of the negative pieces of the Hmong culture. But not everybody is negative. Not everybody is not loving. And so if we can all hold that grace and think that we all want to show up with love, and that even though, you know, if you don't come to my feast this time, it's not because you're rejecting me.
Right.
It's because you're probably genuinely busy.
Yeah, you're just doing something
Right?
else.
And then if I can think of it that way, then when you need my help, if I'm not gonna be like, well, he didn't come to mine, so I'm not gonna go to his. It's like, I'm free, so I'm gonna go. And when I'm not free, I'm genuinely gonna be apologetic about it. If we can exist within that space, I think then we don't have to worry about funerals.
Yeah.
And we don't have to worry about weddings.
Yeah.
Because we know we're all showing up with love, but we're also juggling so many things in this individualistic
Yeah.
world.
And
Yeah.
are we seeing that more? Like, I guess in the older generation where maybe they're more understanding that maybe their children's times are like, or are a lot, or their schedule are a lot busier, and are they more forgiving for stuff like that?
Well, I think this younger generation is struggling to understand the Hmong expectations.
Yeah.
And so they are
Yes.
completely chasing their dreams.
Yeah. Sorry.
And it's hard because then they don't show up at feasts.
Yeah.
And the older generation are kind of grieving that because it's like, oh, you need to come. Oh, we're not going to come. We're going to go, I don't know, to Chicago.
Yeah.
You know, and
We're
it's
gonna
like-
go, yeah.
Yeah, and it's like, but you just went to LA last weekend.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know? And I think that's the part where I would encourage the younger generation to be less individualistic.
Yeah.
And everything in moderation.
Right.
I
Yeah.
often believe in that. A too good of a good thing is not good, right? Or
Right,
too much of a
yeah.
good thing is not good. So if you're constantly living your best life individualistically,
Right.
that might feel good in the moment, but it's also
Yeah.
not keeping
Yeah.
you connected
You distance
to
yourself.
your connection.
I think that's a great point because like we always expect so much of our parents to be more understanding, and we always, you know, we're demanding that they're sympathetic towards our, you know, our things, but sometimes like we don't give them the grace,
Yeah.
you know, as the younger generation.
I feel like I've gotten better at it myself, but it takes a while.
Yeah.
Like I gotta become old myself
Yeah.
to be like, oh yeah, like, and that's unfortunate. I think I just accept it as life. That is just the way it goes. That is how I learn. That's how we learn. As we
Yeah.
get older, we just see our parents getting older, and we can physically see it. So it maybe connects with us more. Like, oh yeah, I should probably
Yeah.
try
I'm
to
still
like,
getting there.
I should understand them more.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's
life experiences are the best lessons.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunate.
It's
Yeah.
unfortunate because we look at others. We always play the comparison game, which is I always say the comparison game for me is a good and a bad. It's good when it fuels me. It's bad when it just makes me look down upon myself. But I still use it because it fuels me sometimes in my competitive drive when it comes to business and stuff like that. But yeah, no, a lot of things to navigate.
Yeah. Well, question for you. You've been in the field for 20 years. How have you seen, I guess, the Hmong collective outlook on mental health? Like, have you seen a change in that? Are younger people more understanding? And then are older individuals becoming more understanding of that as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've been doing this since '96. So it's been a very long time.
Yeah.
If you think about it, some people who are listeners, and maybe you too, were
Yeah.
probably not even born yet
Yeah.
Yeah,
at that
yeah.
time.
Yeah.
And back in the days, we always talked about how mental health is stigmatizing, right? How and not only that, but the other phrase is mental health does not exist in our home community, and because of the way that we understand mental health symptoms, right, and the way that we think about health and healing and well-being, and so health and healing and well-being is more of a spiritual cause or a physical cause, never a mental health
Yeah.
or mental cause. And so when I went to graduate school, I even pondered upon this notion of, do we have schizophrenia in our community?
Oh,
Do we have bipolar in our community? Right? Because I question that because you don't hear about it, you
Right.
don't see it.
Are there even words for it?
There
I mean,
aren't words for it because
okay, yeah.
if you have symptoms that might be diagnosed as schizophrenia, then you're going
yeah.
to
Yeah.
be a
Yeah.
shaman.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
If you have symptoms that are more major depressive disorder, maybe you're not sleeping well, you're not eating well, you're crying all the time, then it's like a spiritual cause because maybe your soul is extremely sad. If you have symptoms of anxiety where you're worried all the time, maybe you have a lot of startled, reactions and you're just on edge a lot of time, then maybe right? And so we have words in Hmong that are very physically linked or spiritually linked. And so that's why we think that, mental health doesn't exist in the community. Well, to this day, I still hear that in the community.
Yeah.
So I'm like, whoa, that was '96, that was 2000.
Yeah.
We still have that narrative
yeah.
in the community. So in that sense, it hasn't changed much, right? But it has changed in many sense in that, and this varies by region and state. So Minnesota is a little bit more open to the mental health concept than in other states that are a little bit more isolated. They still are, they're still more traditional in the way that they think about mental health. But the change that I've seen through the years is, and especially post-COVID, where mental health has just kind of been on the rise and on everyone's mind, that we are having more and more conversations about mental health, right? And so the millennials, the Gen Zs, the Gen Ys, right? They are really bringing these conversations to the forefront, much like you guys. And so there is a greater receptivity, more openness to having conversations around mental health, and not in a stigmatizing but more, or you're crazy, but more in a I'm learning new tools to help you. Right. And even in the narratives of the clients that I see. So I started working with older clients back in 2009 or so, because before that I was working with kids mostly. And I've seen the narrative that they come in change. Whereas before they would often talk about, they would often say things that aren't about, it's okay, sana, right?
Yeah.
It's okay, sa is a new terminology, the way you
Yeah.
think. You lose your lunju, right? Just your lungs and your liver. But people now will say, the way that I think is impacting the way that I live my life. I'm thinking too much. And that's why it's causing great anxiety. That's a very new thing that I'm hearing. Whereas a long time ago, it's just like, well, I don't know why I'm like this. Maybe I need to go see a shaman. And so that has shifted. And even the idea of self-love, I know we talk about that, right? Right now, everybody's like, you have to love yourself. And even the older generation, older than myself, are coming in saying, whereas that was not something that we embraced as a narrative. Again, back in the days, it's like, you have to love your relatives and your community first. And so there is that shift. And part of that shift is that open-mindedness to mental health.
Yeah.
And then, of course, now we're seeing a lot of younger generation who
Okay.
are on platforms talking about their mental
Yeah.
health.
Right.
And that's been wonderful to see. So
And-
it's encouraging.
I have to ask this. I'm going to get in trouble for asking this, but I'm going to put on my male patriarchy hat.
Okay.
Right? And then, but is it good to have these conversations? Because sometimes I wonder, like, had I not known about a lot of these things, maybe I wouldn't overthink this stuff so much. And then, like, if I don't know about it, then I just don't think about it, and I just continue moving forward with my life. So, like, is this? Can it be bad for someone's mental health to be overthinking this?
Okay, so I think it's a two-part question.
Yeah,
Can I answer
sorry.
it in a two-part question? We are probably really running out of time, aren't we? We're still good. Are we still good?
Yeah, we'll probably
Yeah.
wind down here shortly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Well, the
So-
conversations are really good here.
Yeah. So let's see. So let me think about the overthinking.
Yeah, and again, I'm wearing my my patriarchy hat
Yeah,
now. Like
yeah.
that's and I have to ask just because like that is what some people say like in like I guess why we should talk less about this stuff.
Like
right?
you're overthinking your thoughts, and that's what make
I think
Well-
that is that a common thought?
Well, I guess I have to understand what overthinking is, because if overthinking is overthinking to create anxiety, then and trying to like cover all the bases and then cover all the bases again and then cover all the bases again, then that is definitely not good for you.
Okay.
Because then you're now just adding more worries than necessary.
Yeah, because I'll say this, like one of my favorite classes in college is I took a psychology classes, and then I learned about all of these mental health issues, and then I go, oh, do I have that? Do I
Yeah,
have
like
that?
the
Do I-
aware-
like now, like I'm totally aware of
The
it.
extra awareness,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah,
That's,
and
that's a good point. So to that point, I went through that too.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why is because we all have elements of
Yes.
all of those symptoms because we're human beings,
Yes.
right? But the key is, do we have it to the degree that it causes some challenges in the
Yeah.
way that we show up? And so we have different spectrums. We have kind of like the normal or the typical spectrum of, yeah, we all have worries, as an example. And it's normal and it's healthy to have worries. So if we didn't have worries, we wouldn't show up on time for this podcast.
Right.
Yeah.
We wouldn't, have all of these things set up very nice. We're like, yeah, we'll just get there, and then we'll just put it up. But we want it to be good. We worry about it, looking nice and pristine. We want to pass that class. We want to get that job. So we're going to have that stress so that we study for that test, so that we, dress appropriately for that job interview. So anxiety is not bad. And so we all have some form of anxiety,
Right.
some form of worry. And we all feel sad, and we all feel those range of symptoms that are listed in the DSM-5. But it's when it gets to be so much that it interferes with our ability to be a contributing citizen, that it interferes with our ability to show up the way that we want to show up. And then it becomes a clinical situation. It
Yeah.
becomes clinically diagnosable, and that's where we treat. So when you're reading the symptoms in the DSM-5 and you're like, oh, I got that.
Yeah.
It's like, it's okay.
Yeah.
It's still functional. Like some people will be like, I'm so OCD-ish, right? And OCD is obsessive compulsive disorder, which talks about this need for order, this need to get things done. But you know what? If you have some symptoms of that because you're constantly, polishing your table, but if it's not clean, you can carry on this conversation,
Right.
let's say, then that's okay to have that. You just like things to be orderly.
Right.
But if you're having to do that, and if it's dusty and you can't get it out of your mind,
Right.
and you got to
Right.
go
Can't
and get
function.
the
It's
dust, you
affecting
can't
your
function
life.
because you're just obsessed
Right.
about it. Then of course it becomes a symptom that is
Okay.
clinically concerning.
Yes. Okay. Thank you for
Yeah.
that. And then before we get into the some of the guest questions, and we talked a little bit about patriarchy, right? How can we, as Hmong men, I guess, partner with, our with women to kind of help support them in their battles. Sorry.
I love that question.
Yeah.
I love that question because I want Hmong men to know that they are in a place of privilege compared to Hmong women. Because I think nowadays Hmong men kind of have the mentality of being the victim. Because we're now in America. America is giving too many rights for women. And now the women are all stepping all over us. And the women are cheating on us. And the women are telling us what to do, right? And again, that's the narrative that not every Hmong man, I have to qualify that, but some Hmong men are holding to because they don't realize that they came from a place of privilege. And now we're just kind of equalizing that in a way where we can mutually respect each other and coexist in healthy ways. They're seeing it as they're losing their status. And if you can think about yourself as in a place of privilege, then I think it'll be easier for you to see your partner, your sister, your mom differently, and then to be able to uplift them and support them. And because a lot of, I think, Hmong men, not everyone, feel threatened by educated women. And this is, I'm not making this up. This is not research.
Yeah.
You know, I've heard it.
And I think we hear that a lot too.
It's like, oh, don't let your wife it's a fear-based existence. And how can Hmong men be happy if they live under that fear-based thought, right? But if you can nurture your spouse, can love your spouse, can show respect for your spouse, and they can do the same, then you don't have to worry about that, because at the heart of every unhappy marriage is mistrust, right? It's not that, oh, my wife is now smarter, so she thinks she can do better, so she's now cheating on me. It's because something about that relationship has led to unhappiness and mistrust. And so I would encourage men to think of themselves as in a place of privilege, not in an abusive way, but to say, I think I have less barriers, less battles that I have to fight. So how can I also recognize that and know that I have a role to support my female counterparts who might come from an oppressive perspective where they have to fight harder. And I do get that Hmong males also struggle with the expectations, that privilege. And it may not feel like privilege. It might feel like obligations, burdens. Right? And I get that. And I didn't get that until I was older. Because when I was younger, it's like, man, I want to be a boy. Because then I wouldn't have to fight all these battles of, and then I realized, oh, the flip side of it is that guys are probably like, man, I want to be a girl. Because every day it's like, and so it then comes down to personality.
Yeah, exactly.
Because some Hmong men really don't want to be a leader. They just want to do their quiet thing. They want to be in the kitchen cooking. And it's like, oh, that's women's work. It's like, but I love cooking, right? Or some women just want to be the leader. It's like, oh, you're a daughter, you can't do that. And so now we're starting to, again, coming back to the collective and the individualistic, now we're starting to see the individual. And if we can do that and say there is no danger, there is no risk to us losing our Hmongness, we can all coexist and honor each other's strengths, then we can still keep the Hmongness of Beishi Lu, Shipa. You know, we come together in times of need, but we honor our differences.
Well, there's a lot of collectivism in that thought, right? If we could embrace our women that are thriving, to embrace them and feed them even more positivity, then they're going to keep growing. And there's a collectivism there where they're going to make us shine, us as a community. But you got to be able to take your ego away for that.
Because their fear, right?
Yeah, you got to be able to take your ego away for that. And I've always said too in the podcast, like, I see Hmong women, I've always seen from my family, right? When I just look at the guys, the boys and the girls, to me, the girls I've always seen go harder, longer, education, more. And the men, it became their downfall to be privileged now became a downfall because now we're in an individualist culture where now I'm seeing some of the guys like, dang, why aren't you guys doing nothing? But all the girls is out there doing something cool. So it became what was once something of privilege also became a crutch.
Yeah.
And now I see Hmong women
yeah.
thriving so well. And I'm never, when I see Hmong women thriving, I'm never offended because if anything, I look at it in a community sense that it empowers us as a
Yeah.
whole.
Yes.
So it's like, let's go, keep going,
Yes.
keep going. It motivates me as an individual,
Right.
So I look at it on an individual perspective.
Because we all benefit. When
we all
one
benefit,
woman-
yeah,
one
we all
woman
benefit.
rises,
Yeah.
We all
as a
benefit, yeah,
community,
exactly.
But sometimes we don't feel that way. And so sometimes it's kind of confusing. Like, why can't we keep the collective mindset of that? Because when one woman rises, we're like, oh.
We all rise,
like,
yeah.
Then we're like now below. And it's like, no, that's not,
Yeah.
that's a very individualistic.
Yes.
Yeah. And I always say, like, when our partners and the women around us are doing better, like, generally, we're happier.
Yeah, as a family too. We're
I mean, we're both like dating very like highly educated women, like successful in their fields, like, or not dating, married. We're both married
Yes.
to like.
Feels like dating. That's even better.
Sorry, Barb. But I think the better off they do, the happier they are, the more they develop their sense of
You're all thriving
autonomy.
individually,
We all
so that
Exactly,
you
yeah.
can thrive as a collective.
Yes.
I mean, that's really the message here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How do we honor each other to thrive individually
Right.
so that when you come together, you thrive as a collective
Yeah.
and not one is pulling the other or
Yeah.
dragging the other one down.
Yeah.
And may I speak to something you said earlier, Pam,
Yes.
about the question that you said about is too much talking bad? Should we not talk about it? And I addressed it, but I also want to name this, and this will probably
Yeah.
open up a whole different can of worms. But
Yeah.
I want to say this just very briefly, that to not address it is very dangerous.
Yes.
We
Yeah.
see the suicide and homicides in our Hmong community. Not that it doesn't exist in other communities, it does,
Yeah.
but it does. It happens in our Hmong community in higher proportions, higher percentage
Yeah.
relative to the community,
Yeah.
right? And part of that, and what I've heard is that sometimes Hmong men will say, "Oh,
Yeah.
and that is a very minimizing statement because we know that not everybody who gets angry
Yeah.
can act that way. It's
Right.
years of suppressed emotions, of unresolved conflicts, unresolved mental health struggles, whatever it is. And so, suppress and suppress and suppress, it will blow up. And it will blow up in very extreme ways. And which is
Yes.
why we see a lot of these really reactive behaviors. And so it is important for us.
Yeah, and they get and, they, and
Yeah.
it goes really violent, and it ends up on the
Yeah.
news, and it's what we
Yeah.
see all the time.
Yeah.
And it's a fear it's a really deep fear that I have for my Hmong sisters.
Yeah.
Because that part of the Hmong culture as men, I've always found it very toxic. Like if you're not that, but that's just my perspective. Like if you're really not that happy, then just leave, dude. Go
Yeah.
find somebody else who makes you happy. But maybe he'll do the same thing with the next and the next, which
Yeah.
is his issue, right?
Which,
It's
yes.
Yeah,
that
but
person's
yeah.
issue.
What?
Awareness.
Yeah.
But I just feel bad for the Hmong sisters who gotta go. I mean, and sometimes my wife is like, "Oh, you're so misogynistic," and I'm like, but that makes me
Yeah.
have to dig deep and say,
Yeah.
man, I don't want to be called that. Like I don't like that. I don't like that about the Hmong culture myself. And now my wife's telling me that. I'm like, oh God, it's influenced me. My Hmong culture has influenced me too. So then it makes me dig deep and say, am I really being like kind of too much of a guy here? And it's hard. It's hard.
But
Yeah,
you know
yeah.
what? We have to be a forgiving culture, meaning that if you've hurt me once, I have to be able to forgive you and say, maybe you didn't know.
Yeah.
And maybe if I share it with you, maybe you will dig deep and maybe you will show up differently, right? Because if we don't start there, how are you going to be
Communication,
able to
Right,
a lot of
yeah.
If I'm
talking.
already saying, oh, you're just like the rest of them, then of course I'm already putting up a wall. But
Right,
if I
right.
say, hey, this is how I feel
Yeah.
when you acted that way, then and if you're like, oh, I genuinely want to understand how I showed up and why I showed
Right.
up the way I did, and then you change, and the second time you change, then that's great. But if you show up the same time, the second time, the third time, the fourth time, the fifth time, then I'm sorry, you don't want to change,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And so I think
exactly.
we have to be able to forgive and share and be vulnerable.
Yes.
And when we can all agree to that, then and we're all working on our own individual selves, and I think we all hurt other people
Right.
unintentionally
Yes.
and maybe
Right.
intentionally.
Yeah.
But if we can go back and say, geez, I didn't feel good when I did that.
Yeah.
I want to change.
Yeah.
And we do make that change, then we're only going to be better as an individual and as a collective.
Yeah. I have to say too, before we get too far, I didn't really say that. I was, put on my character hat, my patriarchy hat, and it's not what I believe, but
Yeah.
I just had to
It's
put
you-
that
you
out there.
put it-
Yeah.
you put it-
Yeah.
Advocate.
Yeah.
Disclaimer?
Yeah.
Your disclaimer?
I wasn't
Yeah.
asking that for myself.
No, but I think it's always a work in progress to,
Yeah.
and I just like to say to people who are listening, especially to guys who, however you define your whatever your definition of like macho is or strong, for me, I just look as therapy as like it's easy to go to the gym and work out on your muscles and you look good, you feel good, but like as I get older and understand more about therapy, I always say the mind is it's a muscle too, and
Yeah.
and that's just mental gym, right? Mental gym is
Yeah.
if you have mental gym and then you have spiritual gym
Yeah.
and then you have physical gym, well, you're gonna be a great version of yourself, which
Yeah.
your entire family will benefit directly. Well, not even just your family. Anybody who interacts with you is gonna highly benefit from you being
Right.
your best version.
Yeah.
Well, and I love the both of you, how you show up, because you're really talking about being in marriages where you respect your spouses and your spouses respect you. And I think I've always thought about this, in the way that I show up, and I always say, wouldn't it be great to just have couples who coexist, who have this reciprocal relationship of mutual respect and love, but you also have your respective roles that you fulfill, but still honoring each other.
Yeah.
And that would be a great model for among families, because in many ways we've not had that model. In many ways, it's always been if one is doing well, then the other must be just, groveling and just less than.
Right.
And so I love that you guys talk about that, so that we can have more and more couples who are coexisting, succeeding individually and succeeding together and loving each other and doing things separately like this, but being supported by your spouse. And so I appreciate the two of you just creating this space for that conversation and to put that at the forefront. And earlier, when we started, both of you said, well, we just saw need. And I think
Yeah.
sometimes when you have that conviction, there's that word again, and that passion, which I think both of you do, and you just think, gosh, we really need this. And you started without knowing all the ins and outs of it, but you just have this compelling emotion that you have to do it. And then you do it, and you do it because you believe in it, and you do it because you get the support, and you do it because you love it. And you're right, you don't know where it's gonna go. You don't know what direction it's gonna go, but you just pour your true self into it, you pour your honest emotions, and you pour your love into it, and then it just grows and grows and grows. And I think, I can speak the same to my life. It's that I didn't know I was gonna be the first, licensed psychologist who's Hmong. In Minnesota, the first ones are out in California. I have to qualify that. I'm not the first one nationally. But I didn't know that. I just followed a passion. I didn't even know where it was going to land me, but I just stayed true to who I am. I just stayed true to my love. And I think that's what you guys are doing is how do you just stay true to who you are, especially if it's not hurting anyone else?
Yeah.
Right.
Then the rest just
It's
follows.
blocking and filtering the outside noise, which these days
Can
with
be
social
hard.
media
Yeah,
even
it's
more.
tough.
Oh boy.
Let's
Oh
not
boy.
even talk about that.
No,
Yeah.
that's for a different
that's
day.
like a whole
because
nother
that's a different
podcast.
day.
Yeah.
But even as an adult, it affects me, and I'm a pretty
Yeah.
confident. I would say I'm well aware of myself. I've tested myself in many physical, mental ways, but even social media still gets me. And I'm like, and like I say, I won't open that because it's a whole new can of worms. But I'm like, for teenagers and children, and
Yes.
oh god, or for people in general, it's
For
so
even
much
me.
noise.
Like
Yeah.
So
I'm
much
old,
noise.
right? And I think I have a fairly okay foundation. I can get sucked into that, so I don't stay on it anymore.
Yeah,
It's
well,
hard.
like Peng and I say, sometimes it's just if you catch me at the right day, right time, and for some reason I read that comment, I've noticed times when my whole
Yes.
mood
Yeah.
shifts,
Yes.
and I'm like, I was just telling Peng this the other day. somebody made a comment about our podcast, and I took it personally because it's us, right?
Yeah.
So I took it personally, and then I analyzed my own feeling, and I'm like, 5 seconds ago,
Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
in different mindset. Now I'm in this mindset, and I don't even know
Yeah.
this person,
Yeah.
and I'm like, oh wow, this is very toxic. I could see why it becomes a rabbit hole
Yeah.
for where it's. I love
Yeah.
social media. It's beautiful because I learn a lot from it. But
Yeah.
and like I
But
said,
we have to limit ourselves.
Yes,
to it,
yeah,
right?
it's-
Because we're humans.
Yeah.
And we, our emotions are often influenced by other people.
Yeah.
But we have to, like you said, we have to kind of pause and then reflect and say, whoa, I'm giving
Yeah.
way too much power.
yeah, to
Yes.
This voice.
100%.
it's hard
Yeah.
sometimes though.
Yeah, I've had to
It
talk
is
to my
hard.
therapist about some comments
Yeah,
too.
it's hard sometimes,
Yeah.
but yeah, should we
Yeah,
go to?
oh, yeah, yeah,
let's just
let's
do
get
one or
into-
two
okay.
because I think we're
Yeah,
definitely
yeah,
running
we-
pretty long.
Yeah, we
so
got into some great
I'll
conversations.
Let you choose one. I'll choose one.
You may have to edit this to make it shorter.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I think the conversation's solid.
No,
so you
I-
can't do that.
I think people need to hear the conversation in its whole.
Yeah, it's an
you
important
know?
conversation.
You guys
Yeah.
are being very real.
It's a
Yeah.
very important
That's
conversation.
beautiful.
We usually don't edit anything unless a guest wants
Okay.
to edit something. But
I'll
here,
let you pick
let
one,
me,
I'll find one.
Get into some questions. Where would I have to find it? Okay, so. One question I saw earlier, I can't find it now, but it was because you also teach cultural sensitivity, how do we teach cultural sensitivity specifically to working with Hmong patients to, I guess, non-Hmong
Yes.
professionals?
Yes. That's a great question, and thank you for whoever asked it.
Yeah.
I think we've been kind of touching on it with our own personal experiences, is that we have to recognize that we bring our whole self into any dynamic, any interaction that we have, right? Whether we're conscious of it or not. And our whole self are the intersectionalities of our identities, right? And sometimes the intersectionalities of our identities influence the way that we interact with others, whether they be biased or not, because a lot of times we have unconscious bias. And we as Hmong people have our own unconscious bias towards our Hmong people, right?
Yeah.
And towards non-Hmong people. And so that cultural sensitivity has 3 components.
Okay.
The first component is looking at us as the individual self, us as the provider, us as the professional, us as the person that's leading the conversation, or whatever it is, in whatever environment that is. And so we have to really work hard at our own self-awareness, right? That word cultural humility. How do we become aware of our biases? How do we engage in processes that would help us to be aware of that? And so that we're also aware of what we're grounded on. Because we have to know our true self and our biases, so that when we're engaging with communities of a different culture, like a non-Hmong engaging with a Hmong person, that we know our whole self. And when we go into that situation, we can completely stay grounded who we are, but also understand where they're coming from, so that we're not judging, so that we're not showing up with words that might be hurtful, words that might assume. So cultural humility is a process. It's a lifelong, and we can never learn too much about ourselves, because we're also changing, and so are communities. So we might say, oh, I've learned a lot about the Hmong culture, right, if we're working with Hmong families, but that might look different 10 years from now. I mean, it was different 10 years ago, right? And so it's that ongoing process of understanding ourselves. And then it's also, that second part is understanding our community. So in order to be culturally competent and sensitive, we have to understand the framework, the cultural framework of our Hmong community, knowing that there is also variation, because it's a spectrum. And we touched on that earlier, where we're not all the same. But we need that framework, because if we don't have that framework, we're not going to know how to ask the questions, right? We might ask questions that are insensitive. We might ask questions that are condescending. that are offensive. And so we need to have that framework so that if I'm talking to you and let's say, and I understand the whole thing about Hmong males, then I can ask my questions in a more sensitive manner. And you might not fall into that framework, but at least I know my starting point, right? So I might say, are you an only son?
Yeah.
And because I already know what that means in the Hmong culture, because I've already learned enough about Hmong culture, right? And then the third part is to understand the gaps. Where are the gaps in the Hmong community? And if I can understand the gap, then I can integrate my whole self, the cultural humility, the cultural understanding into understanding and meeting the needs and then addressing the needs in a culturally sensitive way.
Okay. Awesome.
A lot of complexity. As I listen to it, like a lot of complexities, a lot of having to, I think a lot of self-awareness to understand that. And I love that you highlighted because it is hard. It's hard and it's complex.
And it's not one answer for
all. And it's not one, exactly. And so it comes back down to probably just great communication and a lot of it.
Yes.
And a lot of it.
Right.
A lot of it.
Yeah.
And
sometimes it's like difficult to find a therapist, and you know
that's why therapy is helpful because it doesn't pertain to everyone. So you have to do it on your own soul
right.
research.
Yeah.
All right. So
next question.
Yep. I'm just gonna pick one that's slightly. Some of them are quite kind of intricate, but so we're just gonna go with one here that's a little bit shorter. So it's just the question is just what's your thoughts on Hmong Gen X and Gen Z's mental health awareness? And I think we touched about a little bit, but what's your thoughts on? I guess I would say the generation after you, us and younger than us even,
I think
with mental health.
Definitely because your generation and the younger generations, you think more individualistic than collective, first and foremost, broadly speaking, right? Because you were born and raised here, your primary language might be English and secondary is Hmong. And so the way that you think about the world is automatically in English first, and the way that you think about the world is automatically more individualistic. Then you do understand mental health and you do embrace the Western way of understanding mental health more easily. And so you're the ones that are educating us, the older generation, about mental health. Mind you, there's still some hiccups and some hang-ups because our Hmong culture is also so close-knit that we can kind of get overwhelmed by all of the different factors. But there is that movement that is more open to talk therapy, that is more open to the benefits of our own mental well-being, and engaging in activities that would help us to be more mentally healthy, like surrounding ourselves with positive people, affirmations, meditation, right, music, and all of that. So I think the younger generations are definitely more open to that. But back to your point, there's a study that just came out and APA wrote on it, is that the younger generation are the most unhappy generation.
Really?
And the U.S. has fallen off of the top 10 happiest countries because of course, social media, but also all of the pressures of having to be, at the top of their game. I think there's a lot of pressure right now.
I think I want to go back to, I think what you were alluding to, and maybe it's not what you were alluding to, is what I kind of had heard. But capitalism combined with an overly too much individualistic together.
Right.
Like, is that what we're seeing that is bringing up depression? Bringing up things like that versus a collective. And I wouldn't even say Asia. I wouldn't say Asia as a whole because Asia, Japan, Asia, Korea, Seoul, Tokyo, I mean, those are even just
completely different,
even harder capitalists, I think, maybe in some ways. But like Laos, the more collective. I mean, I would assume that.
I think it's a good question. And what comes to mind is, have we swung too far?
I wonder that sometimes.
On the other side of the pendulum towards individualism, that has caused a lot of stress for us, right? Because right now, a lot of people are rejecting frameworks and expectations and what you said earlier, guidance and rules and all of that, because we want to explore our individualistic things. But when we swing too far and we don't want order in terms of structure, we get chaos. Because now we don't know what we're doing. We're seeking for that next high. We're seeking for that next thrill. We're seeking for that perfect experience. We're seeking for that euphoria. And I don't think that exists. But we are holding it in our mind as sort of this romanticized, when I arrive. It'll be all great. There is no arriving. There is just in the moment.
I think that one's hard for business owners. As a business owner, you're a business owner. I always battle myself with that when I arrive. Like, what are you arriving to? Like, what are you trying to get to? Like,
I mean, it's great to have goals to achieve, but there's no arriving.
There's no arriving.
Because my husband is a very wise guy, and he always says, when you make this much money, you're going to want to make more money.
It never ends.
And I was like, are you kidding me?
It never ends.
It's true. You know?
It is true. It is true. Because, too, I think in business, if you can unlock the key to that level of money, you're like, well, I forgot the key now. I know. So now I'm going to go for the next. And then I have, thankfully, great friends that always tell me, dude, eventually you're just going to die like the rest of us. And it's such a simple statement, but it's very true because I sit on it and I say, they're not wrong. Like, they're not wrong. I can't change myself because I'm ambitious like this. I'm being myself. But I'm being honest that your statement is very true too. And so it's like, okay, oh God, you gotta, and a little bit is age too. You see yourself getting older, so you say, oh yeah, I gotta, I should go enjoy life a little bit too. But mental health as a whole, there's just so much to think about and talk about, and it's difficult. It's complex. It's
when you learn about the brain, you realize that there's millions of small micro interactions going on.
All the neurons firing.
And so if you have one or two things that are misfiring, it can cause
the whole engine. The whole engine.
It can be catastrophic for a person. One more question for you. You said that in your younger years, you like to go to the mall and observe and specifically look at people's shoes. Looking at our shoes, what can you tell us about us?
First of all, mine's not tied, so that's not good to start.
I did say I would wonder, but I didn't say
Okay. What would you wonder about? This is just for fun.
I get the tennis shoes.
Fun, lighthearted.
Just loose laces right now.
What your shoes tell me is that you guys are really just comfortable in your skin, and this is just like a casual thing, and it's going out into the world, but you guys are kind of like, we're showing up as who we are. And one shoe is untied and one is, but that's my off day. It's my off day, and this is what I do for fun. And you identify yourself as an ambitious person, and you're embracing that. And so when people look at you, they're like, how do you find the energy to do that? And you're like, that's where I get my energy from. And not everybody can be you. Not everybody can be ambitious, and they have to also embrace that. Because they're going to run themselves dry if they try to catch up to you. Because for you, you're just like, this is
it's the normal. The speed feels correct.
Right. And so we have to honor our own speed and our own pace. And when we can honor our own pace, then we can show up as ourselves authentically. And that's why you guys are hanging out on a Sunday and just chilling in your comfortable clothes.
And learning. And learning. And meeting people like you. So with all that said, I think you're our longest running podcast, but because this topic is so...
it's so much.
Well, it's because Peggy and I also really like the topic. We like the topic. We enjoy... That's where we've learned the most about ourselves, in this topic, in this gym, right? Not the... Because we met initially from working out at the physical gym. And so
which is also good for our
Which is
mental
also
health.
good for us, But
just coming on as we wrap up, it's just like, gosh, we didn't even touch on half the things we wanted to talk on.
No,
so we
I had
can
a lot
go
of
on for
questions
hours,
written,
but
but
this is great.
It's a great start.
So we always like to ask our guests, where can they find you or anything that you might have going on, whether it be your businesses, your clinic, anything like that, that they can know where to find you?
So if you want to go on our website for the clinic, we have about 6 clinicians that are providing direct psychotherapy services who are all Hmong speaking. Our website is vanguardmhclinic.com. So that's VanguardMHCLINIC.com. And then if you are a podcaster, you can find us on the podcast channels, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, other major podcasts, and it's Hmong Mental Health Podcast.
Awesome.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thank you for your time on, like you said, on all of our off days.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming in and for having this discussion. And I think you left not just us, but all the listeners probably asking more questions about ourselves. And that's ultimately why we do this, is to make people, is to make ourselves, like we always say, it's selfishly to make ourselves question ourselves by these interactions. And that's how we grow. That's how everybody grows in their own way. And so I'll let you do the whatever lasting words you want to have, but just thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having this growth mindset and modeling this growth mindset, and then for prioritizing mental health, and also for highlighting Hmong men's mental health.